There is a specific moment almost every person has experienced. You've got a full afternoon blocked. The task is important. You actually want to get it done. And yet, somehow, 90 minutes later, you've deep dived into the migratory patterns of Arctic terns and written absolutely nothing. It's not that you forgot what needed to happen. You knew exactly. Your brain simply staged a silent, extremely convincing mutiny, and you didn't even notice until the damage was already done. This is the video that explains exactly why that keeps happening, and more importantly, the specific brain hack that psychologists have developed to make hard things feel genuinely, neurologically easy. Here is your reason to stay. Somewhere in part 4 of this video, I'm going to give you a technique so disarmingly simple, it takes 3 seconds, requires 0 willpower, and is the exact same method that high-performance psychologists teach surgeons and athletes before any session of critical focused work. It doesn't involve a planner, a cold shower, or a motivational speech. It works specifically because it bypasses the part of your brain that needs willpower in the first place. If you've ever spent 3 hours completely absorbed in a video game, but couldn't hold focus for 15 minutes on something you genuinely care about, that is not hypocrisy. That is the single most important clue in this entire puzzle. The problem has never been your character. The problem is that you've been trying to solve a neuroscience issue with a discipline solution, and those two tools are completely incompatible. Everything you think you know about motivation, effort, and productivity is built on top of one chronically misunderstood brain chemical, and getting that chemical right changes the entire equation. To understand how to fix it, we first need to see what your brain is actually doing when it refuses to work, and what it reveals is stranger than most people expect. Here is what your brain is doing every single waking moment that nobody tells you about. It is running a continuous cost-benefit calculation on every action you consider taking. High effort, uncertain reward, your brain slams the brakes. Low effort, guaranteed stimulation, green light, every time, without exception, without apology. This is not weakness, not laziness, and not a personal failing. It is millions of years of survival programming from an era when wasting energy could literally get you killed. The problem is that same ancient brain is now operating inside a modern world that has been architecturally designed by some of the most sophisticated behavioral engineers on the planet to exploit exactly those instincts. Every social media platform, every streaming service, every notification sound has been optimized by teams of scientists to trigger your brain's reward system with the minimum possible effort required on your part. You are not fighting your own laziness. You are fighting billion-dollar industries whose entire business model depends on winning that fight against you every single day. Sitting inside your brain is a cluster of neurons called the nucleus accumbens, the brain's desire engine, and it runs almost entirely on a single neurotransmitter, dopamine. And here is the part that changes everything. Dopamine is not the pleasure chemical. Virtually every piece of popular psychology gets this wrong. Dopamine is the wanting chemical. It spikes before the reward, in anticipation of it, not while you're receiving it, which means dopamine is not what makes you feel satisfied. It's what makes you get up and relentlessly chase. When you understand that dopamine is fundamentally about wanting and not pleasure, what modern technology is doing to your motivation becomes genuinely alarming. When neuroscientists wired rats so that pulling a lever sent a direct dopamine surge into the brain's reward center, the results were unlike anything they had anticipated. The rats stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and kept pulling that lever hundreds, then thousands of times, until they physically collapsed from exhaustion. Because dopamine doesn't create satisfaction, it creates insatiable craving. Then the scientists reversed the experiment. They blocked dopamine entirely, and those same rats became so completely unmotivated that reaching for food placed directly in front of them felt like too much effort, even while starving. Here's the critical insight. The rats weren't broken in either direction. They were responding perfectly to the chemical signal. They simply had no control over the signal itself. Your brain works identically. Every dopamine flood you receive from scrolling, gaming, or any other effortless stimulation teaches your brain to expect that level of stimulation as its new normal. This process is called downregulation. Your dopamine receptors literally decrease in number and sensitivity, like your brain turning down the volume because the music has been overwhelmingly loud for too long. The result is a tolerance effect. You need bigger and bigger stimulation just to feel the same level of interest. And tasks that once energized you start to feel completely flat and unrewarding by comparison. This is why someone who has spent years on constant high stimulation genuinely cannot feel motivated by work they would have found engaging before. Their reward system has been calibrated to a threshold that normal life cannot reach. Your brain hasn't become lazy, it has become spoiled. And spoiled brains do not respond to willpower, discipline lectures, or aggressive morning routines, no matter how early you set the alarm. Most people try to force their way through this with raw discipline, and most people fail because they're fighting the system instead of doing what psychologists actually do, which is use the system itself as the weapon. The brain hack psychologists use is called anticipatory dopamine loading, and once you understand how it works, you'll immediately recognize it as the reason certain people seem to move through difficult work with an almost effortless momentum. Remember, dopamine spikes in anticipation of a reward, not upon receiving it, which means if you can create genuine, specific, vividly imagined anticipation before a hard task, your brain will produce the motivation chemical before you have done a single thing. The technique has 3 layers, and the first one takes 3 seconds. Before starting any hard task, close your eyes and spend 3 seconds vividly imagining the exact moment you finish. Not the distant life benefit, not a transformation, but the specific physical sensation of completing this particular task today. Closing the laptop, setting down the weights, hitting send on the email. Picture it with enough specificity that it feels immediate, because your brain cannot reliably distinguish a vividly imagined near future from an imminent reality, and it will begin releasing anticipatory dopamine in response. If you're finding this genuinely useful, hit subscribe right now. This is neuroscience that change. The second layer is deliberate reward sequencing. Pair the hard task with a specific, genuinely desirable reward that follows immediately after completion. Not a vague treat yourself, but a concrete, pre-decided, same-day reward identified before you begin. The specificity matters measurably. I will watch 1 episode of something I love the moment this session ends, produces a stronger anticipatory dopamine signal, then I'll relax later. Because your brain responds to defined targets, not vague intentions. The third layer, and this is the one most people skip entirely, is contrast framing. Deliberately remind yourself before starting what it will concretely feel like to not do this, the specific guilt, the specific cost, because your brain's dopamine system responds to the removal of a threat as powerfully as it responds to the prospect of a gain. These 3 layers, anticipatory visualization, deliberate reward sequencing, and contrast framing, work together to create a synthetic motivation signal strong enough to override your brain's default resistance response without a single unit of willpower required. But here's the catch. If your dopamine baseline has been flooded for years by effortless stimulation, this signal will be too weak to feel, which means most people need to do one critical thing before the hack can reach its full power. Before anticipatory dopamine loading can work at full strength, most people need to complete what psychologists call a recalibration period. And you've probably heard this referred to, somewhat imprecisely, as a dopamine detox. The name is misleading because you're not detoxing from dopamine itself. You're removing the artificial, effortless, hyper-stimulating sources of it that have been training your brain to demand more reward than ordinary life can ever actually deliver. Think of it this way. If you've eaten at a Michelin-starred restaurant for every single meal for 2 years, a home-cooked dinner feels like a punishment. Not because the home-cooked meal is bad, but because your baseline has been permanently reset somewhere it was never meant to live. 7 days is the minimum effective recalibration period 14 produces measurably stronger results, and during that window, your highest stimulation, lowest effort activities need to come off the menu temporarily. For most people, this means the phone, specifically short-form video and social media, but it could equally be gaming, online shopping, or any other activity that delivers intense reward for zero cognitive output. You replace those activities with slower, effort-requiring alternatives, reading a physical book, cooking a meal from scratch, walking without headphones, having an actual conversation, not because these things are morally superior, but because they are neurologically recalibrating. The first 3 days will feel genuinely uncomfortable, restless, irritable, scattered, and that discomfort is the literal biological evidence that the process is working, because it means your dopamine receptor sensitivity is actively adjusting upward. Most people quit on day 2 or 3, right before the shift occurs, and then conclude the whole approach doesn't work, when in reality, they stopped precisely when their brain was closest to its breakthrough. Push through the discomfort, because on the other side is something that, if you've been heavily overstimulated for years, will feel almost foreign. Genuine internal motivation that doesn't need a phone, a pep talk, or an emergency deadline to activate. Getting to baseline is the essential foundation. But if you want to stop repeating this reset every few months and start living from a genuinely different default setting, there is one final layer that makes it permanent. Neuroscience has confirmed something that most people still intellectually underestimate. Your brain is not a fixed structure. It is physically, measurably reshaping itself in real time based on every single choice you make, through a process called neuroplasticity. Every time you choose a hard thing over an easy thing, you're not just completing a task, you are physically thickening the neural pathways that make discipline feel natural and starving the pathways that make distraction feel urgent. Over time, this changes your default setting, not in a metaphorical motivational poster sense, but in a structural, neurological, measurable sense, so that the cognitive effort required to start hard things quietly and progressively decreases. The first tool for accelerating this rewiring is environment design, and this is where most people dramatically underinvest, because your brain doesn't make deliberate choices in a neutral vacuum. It responds to its physical and digital environment with near automatic trained behaviors. If your phone is visible on your desk, you will reach for it, not because you consciously chose to, but because your brain has been conditioned to. And every barrier you deliberately place between yourself and your high-stimulation devices is a structural vote for the brain you are trying to build. Delete social apps and require yourself to access them through a browser. Put your workout clothes out the night before. Prepare food in advance. None of these feel like discipline because they are discipline. They are architecture, and architecture beats willpower every single time. The second rewiring tool is identity language. Research on behavior change consistently shows that people who frame themselves as a type of person, I'm someone who does focused work, are dramatically more consistent than people who frame their practice as an aspiration, I'm trying to be more productive. Your brain treats identity statements as operating instructions. So the language you casually use to describe yourself is not decoration. It's programming, and it runs whether you intend it to or not. The third rewiring tool is community. The dopamine baseline of the people you spend the most time with becomes, neurologically over time, your own. And deliberately spending time with people who do hard things is not a lifestyle preference. It is measurable neural entrainment. Every layer, the hack, the reset, the rewiring, compounds on the one before it, building something that no longer requires management or maintenance. But there is one final thing that no neuroscience can substitute for. Here's the truth that most self-improvement content very carefully avoids saying. Understanding this changes absolutely nothing. Choosing to act on it is the only thing that does. And those two things are not the same. Your brain will tell you to start tomorrow, that right now isn't the right conditions, that you should finish watching first, that you'll have more energy after dinner, and it will be extraordinarily persuasive because it has had a lifetime of practice making an action feel perfectly reasonable. But consider what you are actually trading. Another hour of effortless stimulation that historically leaves you feeling empty and behind, versus a brain that wakes up genuinely excited about its own work, not because it has been disciplined into submission, but because it has been trained to want the right things. The psychologists who developed these techniques were not optimists. They were researchers who discovered that the hard path, traveled consistently, eventually becomes the easy path, because your brain recategorizes repeated effort as familiar, and familiar things no longer trigger the threat response. Here is your one concrete action from this video. Not a 30-day challenge, not a complete overhaul, just one decision. Identify the single highest stimulation, lowest effort dopamine source in your daily life, and remove it for 7 days, starting today, not tomorrow. Notice the restlessness. Track exactly when it peaks and when it begins to fade, and pay close attention to what naturally fills the space once the noise goes quiet. Drop what you're cutting in the comments below, and if this video genuinely reorganized something in how you think about your own brain, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss our videos.